What's that old saying? If it wasn't so bloody serious, it'd be funny. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, excuse me. They've got to be two of the most cartoon names in corporate history. But the US Treasury clearly believes their fall to earth last week could send a wrecking ball through the entire global financial system. Now the unprecedented move to bail out Fred and Fan has been labelled the most dramatic market intervention in decades. In one swift, gigantic gamble, the government, well, the American taxpayer really, has taken on an unimaginable $5.4 trillion in potential home loan liabilities, equivalent to the entire US federal debt. Will it work? And what are the repercussions for not just the US economy, but indeed world money markets in general, including backyards here in Australia? Well, earlier I spoke from Connecticut with Peter Schiff, a leading share broker regarded in the US as a doomsayer, and Stephen Keen, Associate Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Western Sydney, a long-time critic of what he sees as this country's addiction to debt. Peter Schiff in the US and Professor Stephen Keen in Australia, thanks for joining us to talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Peter, could I start with you? Is this capitalism in crisis? Because you've been howling for quite some time that this could be the beginning of the end of the Western capitalist system as we know it, including the American economy and all that goes with it.
Well, it's really socialism in crisis, because that's what we have. Remember, the reason that we had the problem with Freddie and Fannie was because of the implicit government guarantee. If the government wasn't guaranteeing their debt, they never would have been able to borrow so much money. So basically what happened is you had American citizens were basically able to buy houses not on their own credit, but on the credit of the U.S. government. And we had this huge bubble that was inflated that never would have been inflated had we been on a free market economy. And the two biggest creators of the mortgage bubble were the Federal Reserve, which kept interest rates too low, which is a creature of government, not the free market, and Freddie and Fannie, which again were created by government. Absent government in a free market economy, none of these misallocations of resources ever would have taken place.
So Peter, at this point then, you're not surprised at what's happened in the last few days, this so-called bailout, this so-called conservatorship that's now in place, which sounds like a fancy word for bankruptcy to me. So you're not surprised by what's happened?
Well, I've been forecasting the bankruptcy of Freddie and Fannie for years. I wrote about it in my book, Crash Proof, which came out in early 2007. I always said the stocks were going to zero, that they were going to go bankrupt. But, you know, now Paulson is trying to pretend that this conservatorship is not going to cost the U.S. taxpayers any money because there's a guarantee. There's no guarantee at all. All that happens is if Fannie and Freddie ever have any profits in the future, that the U.S. government is ahead of the common shareholders to receive those profits. But there aren't going to be any profits. There's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe even over $1 trillion of losses. And they're going to be borne not just by the U.S. taxpayer, but by anyone anywhere in the world who's unfortunate enough to own U.S. dollars.
Yep. I have to admit, I'm finding it difficult to get my mind around something called Freddie and Fannie being so important to the world's economy. But you mentioned the fact that there is this international flow on. Steve Keen, what about this country? Do you think that Australians are going to suffer? Everybody's saying in America everybody will get hurt by this. Does that include Australia?
It does include Australia, and it's not just Australia that's suffering courtesy of America. We've got our own bubble over here, and we don't have anything like Fannie and Freddie to explain why we've got a bubble. So it's something which I think goes beyond market socialism. It's actually built into the nature of a financial system that encourages speculation. The scale of this bubble is twice as big as any previous bubble back when we did have an unregulated financial system. So if you look at the level of debt that America got itself into in the Great Depression, that was bad enough to cause the biggest economic catastrophe in history. We now have twice as much debt as we had back then. And I think what's actually happened with the Fannies and the Freddies and the US Federal Reserve, it's encouraged the financial system to go to twice the level of speculation it would have done without them being there. And that's really what I see the bad contribution they've made.
But when you're talking about all the problems around the world, remember, the global problems are the result of America borrowing so much money and not being able to pay it back. The credit crunch is that we've been borrowing money, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars from the rest of the world, and now the world is finally beginning to realize that we're not good for the money. We can't pay it back because we've been borrowing to consume. Nobody has loaned us money to build factories, to build infrastructure. We have nothing to show for the trillions of dollars the world has loaned us except empty houses, plasma TVs, SUVs. We've blown the money on consumption, and this is the problem. Ultimately, the solution for the rest of the world is to stop lending us money, economy, let the dollar collapse, let the U.S. economy implode, and the rest of the world just goes about its business.
Peter, that must be heresy to so many people in America to suggest that the so-called strongest and biggest economy in the world is to blame for all of this.
Our economy is no sounder than a dot-com stock was or a subprime mortgage. It's all an illusion. We're flooding the world with our IOUs. We're borrowing from everybody in the world, and we're sucking up resources and consumer goods that we can't afford.
Steve Keen, Peter Schiff's actually living up to his name as Dr. Doom, a doomsayer. But is the picture as bleak as Peter is painting it?
I think you're nicknaming Dr. Gloom, and that's quite as bad as Dr. Doom. But I think, yes, the picture is in that direction. I certainly think that the idea that America's been living on IOUs is valid. Part of the American arrogance at the end of the Second World War was to say, we're the biggest, toughest, strongest country on the planet. You're going to use American dollars for international exchange. What that meant was when other countries ran out of American dollars, when they're running a trade deficit, particularly back when exchange rates were fixed, they were forced to devalue. They had to do something serious. When America ran out of American dollars, it printed more.